as much as we try to prevent mistakes, I do have a chapter in the book that's basically an introduction to mistake proofing, for an audience that doesn't know anything about lean, or like, yeah, we should be trying to prevent mistakes. At the same time, we're going to make mistakes in our attempts to prevent mistakes. So you've got to be open to that, to the idea of being constructive and being able to learn from a mistake to then cycle back to better prevention. If you're punishing mistakes, people are going to just get more creative about how to hide their mistakes. Yep. And that's not a pathway, to improvement, yet alone excellence.
Hey everybody, I'm Elizabeth Swan.
And I'm Tracy O'Rourke, and we're from the Just in Time Cafe, and welcome to our podcast. At the cafe, we wrestle with tough questions, talk to groundbreakers, discuss great books, and get insights from Lean Six Sigma practitioners who are making a difference in the world.
We let you in on cool apps, we bring you the news, and we challenge the status quo so you can build your problem-solving muscles.
So Elizabeth, what is on the cafe menu today?
Today's highlight is our interview with powerhouse author Mark Graban. We are digging into his latest book that just hit the bookshelves, The Mistakes That Make Us. We'll find out how he turned an innovative podcast into a best-selling workplace culture guide for hot apps. We're highlighting how to use your phone and your friends to build your habits of excellence. And for Q&A, we'll address the challenge of showing the gains for continuous improvement. Each improvement effort is an asset, and yet when budgets get tight, dispensing with Lean Six Sigma can become a cost-saving target. We'll talk about why that happens and what we can do about it. It's a hot day at the cafe, Tracy.
It is. Up next, it's hot apps.
Yes, the app is called HabitShare. And it's a simple design. You enter the habits you'd like to form or get better at, and then you share those habits with friends or colleagues so you can motivate each other. For example, I entered my habit of gratitude into the app. And for a description, I wrote, list 3 things I'm grateful for. And for a frequency, I opted for daily. And for a time, it asked me if I wanted to share that habit with anyone. And I entered a friend's email, Tracy, that would be you. And then I searched, right? And it let me know that you were not at that moment a current HabitShare user, right? But then they asked, should they invite that friend to download the app? So I think you've got a little notice, right? Saying that, hey, yes, would you like to download the app? Right. So then once you joined, I got to go in and select you again. So you could see, you could only see that habit, right? So if I could set up other ones, and share them, but because as a default, like all your habits are private. So if you are a private person, it's still a great source of reminders, especially, if you were trying to form a new habit. A colleague of ours is spending 15 minutes a day learning Spanish. So what if she had a buddy doing the same thing, right? They could share milestones. Maybe it would lead to a Zoom call to attempt a conversation in Spanish, or maybe they met at a cafe, right? I forget that people can actually meet in person. But what habit might you use it to form, Tracy? What would you do?
Gosh, so many habits. What I think is very interesting about this app, before I talk about that, is it's really capitalizing on making your commitments public, right? So when you share a commitment, you're more likely to do it than if you just kept it private. So they're capitalizing on this influence strategy, because when you announce to people, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to commit to it, there's a greater sense of accountability and commitment to do that. So I have a question for you, Elizabeth. Did you, when you were going to share a habit, did you have any pause when you were going to go share it with others? Like, okay, if I share this, did you feel like you have a sense of, I mean, it's kind of something you've been doing anyway. It's a habit you've been doing already. But for me, I feel like, oh, before I share this, I better really commit to it if I'm going to tell people I'm doing it. So there's an element of that. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great point because I did pause and I thought, oh, Tracy is already an accountability partner for me. And so I didn't hesitate. I knew it was okay to ask you, but I did think, wow, you have to really think about who you're going to invite into this habit, right? Are they someone who's also trying to do that? Would this help them too? I don't want to bug somebody. So I thought about more like, this has to be something that someone else would enjoy or get something out of. So I have to be thoughtful about who I invite for what, right? So that I did think about.
Yeah, very nice. And to answer your question, what could I use it for? So that I struggle sometimes with, like probably a lot of women who are moms, self-care. And I'm always struggling with creating habits for myself, right? So, doing Qigong in the morning, which I'm still doing. I was renewed, I started it with you a long time ago because you do it. And then I kind of fell off the bandwagon and then I got back on it. Now I'm in front of the TV in the mornings on YouTube with some Qigong, and it's just a 10-minute routine and I love it. But, it's really great for starting new habits and trying to stick to it, which I really love. So Qigong. I also am at the age now where I need to start doing more weights. And I find, I went the whole week and I didn't do any of my weights. So,
Great.
so I do some strength training and keep it regular. And so I think it's a great app for learning new behaviors. And I really like the idea of sharing it. It's so fun to have a friend who is maybe also doing those things and you're creating a partner or having some accountability with that. So I could see that this could be a great app, makes it really easy to use. Everybody's got their phone and you put them in and it tracks things for you. So I really think there's some value with this app as well.
Yeah, it's another habit. I'm thinking about it now. I want to strengthen is my reflection habit, right? So I'm really good as a habit of setting my intentions at the start of the day. I'm not always as good at reflecting at the end of the day on, what actions did I take toward that end and how'd it go, right? What do I want to change going forward? That gets lost. So I set up a reflection habit and I added it to remind me, because you can have reminders or not, right? To remind me at 6:30, because I'm just coming back from the gym. So it's okay for my phone to poke me, it's not bugging me at work. And also I've had a day and I've had some time to like clear my head and go, run around a bit. So then I might be ready to take a beat and think about, well, how'd that go? So that made me think about what's the best time for that. So yeah, anyway, I feel like, there's that Aristotle, it's kind of a riff on an Aristotle quote that someone took it from, because I'm sure in the original, it wasn't as clear, but he's, the idea that, excellence is a habit, right? If you want to be good at, leader standard work or process improvement, like that is a habit. Like, what are you doing each day to be good? So I feel like it's a great app for our world, for the continuous improvement world.
It really is. I agree. And there's so many apps out there for so many things. And I really think it's important to realize what works for you, right? Like, this could be an app that works great for you, or maybe you need to post it on the corner of your computer to remind you every day. Who knows? But I think the point is habits can be hard to build. They take time. And what are you using to help you build habits or help you break habits you don't want?
Yeah.
So great tip. Love that we shared this app. Try it out. See if it works for you.
It's free. I'm Elizabeth Swan, and you're listening to the Just in Time Cafe podcast. In a short while, you'll get to hear our interview with Mark Graban. Next up, it's the disconnect between finance and continuous improvement. Why can't some companies see their process improvement efforts as the assets they are? And I wrote about this in the most recent issue of Cost Management. People responded really strongly because they've seen continuous improvement efforts that they've been a part of, like shelved, dismantled, put on hold, right? As soon as times get hard. But it's a secret weapon, right? To lower costs, improve efficiency, strengthen bonds with customers, which is exactly what you want during a downturn. So how about you, Tracy? What's your take on this?
It's a very important topic because truly this kind of effort can save money. I think, it's important that people know. I think some of the challenges is people don't know how to calculate or quantify savings appropriately. And I think you talk about that. You talk about, the difference between indirect and direct cost savings. So I think sometimes people, I find they kind of want to shy away from it, or they automatically assume, well, I didn't really save any money. Well, yeah, actually you did save money. So I had one project in particular where he reduced motion. He reduced motion for service technicians. So they had to drive to 3 different locations every morning to get their equipment, to get their papers, to get their parts and their supplies. And he cut it down to 2 locations, and he ended up saving every technician 30 minutes. And he was sort of like, well, I mean, I don't really think I saved a lot of money though. And when you really thought about it, and he didn't really want to focus on money because it was sort of a negative, like, cost cutting, and it just wasn't a great message at that moment. And so he really said increasing wrench time, right? I want to increase wrench time so these service technicians can actually do more with the work that they have. So I think showing value is very important. I think it looks different for every organization. And I think depending on what's going on in the organization, but I do believe every project should have some quantification exercise, because it's just good practice.
Oh, yeah.
It's just good practice to understand. And you know what I found is sometimes people don't even realize how much money they saved because they didn't go through the exercise of that.
Yeah. And I think I love wrench time, by the way. That's awesome. And just that spin, like, there's quotes out there, you can't, kind of decrease yourself to greatness, like cutting down on things or reducing errors. You don't reduce yourself to greatness, but you increase wrench time, right? That's the spin you want to hear. That's going to hit people in a different way. So I saw this, a great example of finding the right metric. This was a project I worked for decades helping Starwood Hotels and Resorts, and then Marriott, work on the first big kind of cross-departmental project they did was called Be Safe, right? I was part of the team that designed the rollout for continuous improvement for Starwood. So the big project was Be Safe, and they looked at basically workplace injury, right? All levels of workplace injury and how to prevent those. Now, there's some very clear cost savings. If you reduce workman's comp, right? That's a cost. If you reduce the time people have to stay out of a job, right, because of an injury, right, that hits the bottom line. So they found some very direct ties, and not surprisingly, that project got amazing traction. They saved millions every year, but more importantly, people didn't get injured as much. And culturally, it's fascinating. I've talked to Sally Toyster, who was both head of operational excellence at Starwood and then for Marriott. And she said culturally that's so strong because she sees it in people's behavior. Like if she'd be running a 5S, a kind of a workplace organization cleanup in like a hotel gym as part of Greenbelt training, and she saw somebody on the Marriott side stepped on a box to get, behind a TV set to clean, and all the Starwood folks went, no, that's not safe. Like you need to step on a step ladder. And so that's kind of direct connection, right? And what's different about Starwood, what was different if I look at what people should do is they had finance partners, right? Whenever they had an improvement effort, they said, who's your finance partner? Because they should help you develop the metrics, right? What are the ways you're going to measure the impact of your project? And there's probably lots of ways. Like you're saying, Tracy, there's wrench time, there's movement, there's bottom line money, there's indirect repurposing of hours. So that's a big one. And the last one I'll mention is language. And I feel like we forget that organizations are made of silos, right? As soon as you have, 2 different departments, you've got silos, and people are tribal, and we speak different languages, right? Within an organization, like finance has, EBITDA, EBITDA, and CBA, cost-based accounting. Like they've got their own acronyms. We've got SIPOC and PDCA, and we've got our own jargon. So we're tribal, and like OPEX. I was just looking up OPEX. We use that for operational excellence, and they use it for operating expenses. So the biggest difference is sort of forming that bond, getting people to talk across departments, to understand each other's language, stay closely aligned, pull finance in to think about what are good projects. What do you want to see as improvement efforts, right? They get separated. So when it's time to looking at budgets, they're like, oh, continuous improvement. Well, let's just cut the training or cut things that we see as bottom line costs without seeing all those great assets they have of improvement efforts that are helping them. So I don't know, Tracy, we see it all the time.
We do. And I really believe, as you do, the benefits of continuous improvement are multifaceted. There's hard dollar savings, soft dollar savings, there's cultural impact, there's growing people. And really, it shouldn't just be one focus. It shouldn't just be focusing on growing people, because even though that's wonderful and you could say, oh, we're not focused on money, the reality is you need to show value. Is this working? How are you showing that this is working? Otherwise, it's what's going to happen, just like you said, is people are going to be like, it's doing nothing. We're doing nothing. Let's just kill this.
Kill it.
And there is good stuff happening. And if we're not keeping track of that, it's going to be hard to show value rather than just a thumbs up. Like, yeah, everybody seems happy. We need more than that. And, it really is sad to me when I see organizations, they're doing really great with continuous improvement, and then somebody kills it. Like the initiative just gets cut because the value of it is not being shared.
Yeah. Yep. Connect, finance, and continuous improvement. That's our message.
I'm Tracy O'Rourke, and you're listening to the Just in Time Cafe. We host these monthly, so you can go to the www.jitcafe.com and go to our podcast page.
Coming up next, it's our featured guest, Mark Graban. Tracy, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about Mark?
I would absolutely love to, but I'm going to say, if you don't know who Mark Graban is, where have you been? He's an author of many books, a speaker, a consultant, whose latest book, The Mistakes That Make Us, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation, is available now. He's the author of the award-winning book, Lean Hospitals, Improving Quality, Patient Safety, and Employee Engagement, and others, including Measures of Success, React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. These are awesome titles, by the way. He serves as a consultant through his company, Constancy Inc., and he's also a senior advisor for the technology company Kai Nexus. Mark hosts podcasts including Lean Blog Interviews and My Favorite Mistake. He's everywhere. And he's got a BS in industrial engineering from Northwestern University, an MS in mechanical engineering, and an MBA from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Leaders for Global Operations program. This guy is everywhere. He's doing a lot. And we are so psyched to have him at the cafe.
Yes, we are. Welcome, Mark Graban. We are so looking forward to talking to you.
Yes, we are. Woo-hoo.
Well, hey, Elizabeth. Hey, Tracy. I'm really happy to be back here with you. So I appreciate it. It's always good to see you.
Oh, yeah. The cafe crowd is going to love this.
They are.
Yeah. So, Mark, you and I have been on slightly parallel book journeys, this latest book.
Yeah.
I love that you invited me to co-host your cover reveal event. And it really, to me, it just brought out that people do not know what goes into a book cover, a really great book cover, right? Which yours is.
Yeah.
And now that we've seen the rest of the book, it's totally worthy of the cover.
Well,
And
I'm going to hold up yours. That's a great cover. I'm
It is a great cover.
a big fan of your book and your cover, Elizabeth.
You are a kind man, which is kind of part of what this interview is about. But we are dying to dive in and talk about your book.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So
Tracy,
Yes, thank you. So we are, I'm so excited to read your book, arguably your 8th book. We were talking about, you've got lots of different projects you've done over the years with people, but you are definitely present in the author world, which I love. And your 8th book, The Mistakes That Make Us, could you tell our listeners just a little bit about this book? What's it about and what sparked you to write it?
Yeah. And first, what were you trying to spark an argument about the number of books, or no? Let's just move. It's harder to count up than it should be.
We try not to start our interviews with an argument.
I didn't think so. I came here for an interview, not an argument. But I will answer your question. I apologize. So The Mistakes That Make Us is a project that has roots a little bit in a previous book, Practicing Lean, where 15 other authors and I all wrote a chapter sharing a story of basically a mistake we made early in our practice, early in our career. And so that's been bouncing around in my head and trying to be more understanding about mistakes, my own included. Trying to think about people, what would help people be more open about mistakes. And then, September 2020, I started doing a new podcast series called My Favorite Mistake. And that in that series, every guest is, coming on and very kindly and vulnerably sharing a quote unquote favorite mistake story from their career. Not necessarily their biggest mistake. That's a different question. What's your biggest mistake? But a favorite mistake, it's meant to celebrate the growth and learning or positives that can somehow come out of a mistake. And then, maybe 16, 18 months into doing that podcast, I started to see patterns in the stories and the reflections and the way people were sharing and reflecting on their mistakes. So then that prompted the book project, which then kind of evolved and iterated over time and became The Mistakes That Make Us. Draws heavily on stories from podcast guests, but not exclusively. Like it's not a memoir, but I decided, or it seemed better for me to also include stories from my own career and organizations I've been a part of. So I've come to say it's inspired by the podcast as opposed to being completely based upon the podcast.
Okay. That's really fascinating because that's one of my questions for you is, so now I'm experienced with what is called blog to book, right? As a format, which of course I thought that was like, oh yeah, you just take your blogs and you put them together and then voila, it's a book, which that's not what happened.
Right.
And so you've written kind of podcast to book, but as you're clarifying, you took some liberties. So I'm kind of fascinated with the resulting format of your book. And I want to know how you came up with that.
Yeah. So early drafts, I guess the initial concept was I will collect some of the best, most compelling stories and sequence them and put them into a book. And early drafts relied heavily on like really large chunks of transcript from different episodes. And I was working with a book coach, and I was also working with an editor along the way. And they both encouraged me to not be afraid to use my own voice, that I'm not just a compiler of stories. And sometimes, look, some books are a compilation of stories, and that's fine. But they encouraged me to kind of reframe key points that I thought were worth making, and then use stories from the podcast to illustrate those key points. So it became less a filter of what are, quote unquote, the best stories or the most interesting stories, but it was almost more a matter of like which stories fit. And so then during that evolution and during the editing, there were some hard decisions around like people I love and stories I've loved. And I'm like, it just doesn't fit the flow. And the book, I think I realized, or I got some clarity that this is a management book. It's a leadership book, I guess. It's about organizational learning. And, there were a lot of great stories that were more about, let's say, individual learning and might be better suited to, it was, some of it was feeling like a self-help book. And I don't feel qualified to write that. Now people could argue if I'm qualified to write management books, but There are a couple of chapters and stories I pulled aside, not deleted, but pulled aside, either just to publish as blog posts, or maybe partner up with one of the psychologists who's been a guest on my show and get their input of, like, maybe I should be the secondary author on a book that's more like focused on individuals, of like, how do we get better at dealing with or processing mistakes?
Yeah.
Mhm. I want to go back to something you said that I think is very interesting. When people talk about mistakes, their own mistakes, they're vulnerable, as you said. They're in an environment where they feel safe. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be talking about, this thing that they're very vulnerable about. And they're being kind to themselves, hopefully, in some of these stories.
Right.
But I think that's a very interesting dynamic that we're looking to have thrive in continuous improvement. So, having people talk about their mistakes, we're assuming that there's an environment there that's going to allow for that.
Right.
And yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think, there's two different settings. One is the podcast setting environment, and then one is workplace. So I think with the podcast, I mean, I must be doing something to help people feel welcomed and comfortable. I'm not going to pat myself on the back and say that's all me. I think it's guests who are choosing to voluntarily come, and they know what they're signing up for. And they're choosing to share a story because maybe they're in a position where they think, well, I don't have much to lose. I mean, somebody who's the CEO or the founder of a company, or somebody who's later in their career, like, what do they have to lose by sharing a story about a mistake? And that doesn't mean everyone is going to feel comfortable doing so, but I've managed to attract enough people who, are sharing their stories, and nothing's going to get them canceled or anything embarrassing, right? So they're in a position where they have the confidence and the accomplishments to share those stories. Now, when you think about within a workplace, that becomes a lot riskier or dangerous for people. I cringe. Like, I saw a column somebody wrote online recently of kind of basically taking the stance of, you should admit your mistakes in the workplace. And I'm like, that sounds like really reckless advice. In a generalized sense, because now in the workplace, this comes down to questions of psychological safety. What do you have to gain by sharing a mistake or pointing out a mistake? What do you risk? And I think in a workplace, it's far riskier for employees if their leaders in the organization hasn't demonstrated that it is safe to share mistakes. And I do touch on this in the book a little bit of trying to point out, I am not trying to give blanket advice that says, if you should admit mistakes because that's a mark of character or that's courageous. It's really more about culture and our leaders creating the conditions where people can decide, yes, it is safe to speak up, not out of obligation, but because they know they're going to get a constructive response.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you're absolutely right. The workplace, people sometimes don't feel safe. Leaders sometimes don't want to admit their mistakes. But I think what's interesting is, they think in their head, well, I don't want to admit my mistakes because then I'm not a good leader.
I'm infallible.
And it's interesting because honestly, everybody knows what your mistakes are.
Yes, everyone knows you're not perfect. Yeah, they already know.
Not perfect, and there's something that happens when you have humility to admit the mistake, and people recognize, oh, he's human, he's or she. They're trying, and it changes the behavior. Anyways, I just think it's very interesting. And when I have seen leaders admit their mistakes in the workplace, it's there's something that changes in a good way.
Yes, leaders have to go first. And if you're a founder or a CEO or a leader, you probably quite literally you might have more to lose, but there's less risk of losing it because of your position of power, or ownership, or what have you. So sharing that, the mistake stories of being vulnerable is leading by example and giving permission for others to share mistakes, but then hopefully leaders react constructively when others follow their lead. So these are the things that build psychological safety. Modeling the behaviors you want to see, such as admitting mistakes, and then encouraging others to do the same, and then make sure you're rewarding them for doing the same. But I think without the leader going first, you could encourage. And I think what's not helpful is a leader saying something like, "Oh, this is a safe space. You can admit mistakes here." And like, it's not the space that's safe. It's the people who feel safe or not.
Yeah.
Based on what leaders are doing or not doing.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the leading by example is really necessary.
Yeah. I mean, and you said it, you kind of paraphrased it, but I really like your quote. Speaking up isn't a matter of character or courage. It's a matter of culture. And to me, that quote is liberating because, you know, just having the burden of, I need to speak up. Like, and I always say to people, you know, culture is a contact sport, participate. But what I really mean is as a leader, right? Because I realize it might be a toxic culture and participation might be really risky. As you say, you can't just say, you know, hey, admit mistakes. So I think what you're talking about, a part of what you did in the book is you outline, you know, how do leaders help create this space? How do leaders build psychological safety? Right. And you just said two of them, right? You said model. I think you had a few in there. It's like, you have to also have that intent, right? Do you want it to be safe for people to make mistakes? Like, think about that, own that intention, right? And so I like that you start there.
Yeah. And I want to give a shout out of you know, among the people I've learned a lot about psychological safety from, Timothy R. Clark in his book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. I cite and mention him. He was kind enough to endorse my book. But, you know, that framework of modeling and rewarding vulnerable acts is something I've learned from him. And I think it's really powerful. I think it's really practical.
Yeah, it's funny. Every once in a while, you know, now that I'm an instructor, Tracy's an instructor at UC San Diego, and Zoom and digital gremlins, there's a million ways for things to go wrong. And I think I did something, and, you know, the students were like, yeah, but why is this? And I realized I had, you know, basically screwed it up. And so I said, what we have here is instructor error. And I could see them all just like, and this was a new group. And so I think they all got the message like, oh, okay, so mistakes are going to happen. You know what I mean? And I realized, oh, I should do that as a rule. I should do something to just remind everyone, you know, model, as you're pointing out, Mark, you know, model as a leader, right? Because instructors are leaders, like it's okay.
Yeah. And what we do about it, how we react, the actions we take after a mistake, that can be a choice or could be driven by culture. But you're right, mistakes are going to happen. As much as we try to prevent mistakes, you know, I do have a chapter in the book that's basically an introduction to mistake proofing, you know, for an audience that doesn't know anything about lean, or like, yeah, we should be trying to prevent mistakes. At the same time, we're going to make mistakes in our attempts to prevent mistakes. So you've got to be open to that, to the idea of being constructive and being able to learn from a mistake to then cycle back to better prevention. If you're punishing mistakes, people are going to just get more creative about how to hide their mistakes. And that's not a pathway, you know, to improvement, yet alone excellence.
Absolutely. So a little bit more about the book. So you have each chapter weaves fantastic stories of missteps, gaffes, and some seemingly unrecoverable errors, which we know have to be handled gracefully. You've conducted over 200 interviews, and I'm going to guess it's probably a hard call, but do you have any that maybe two favorites, or some that stand out to you in terms of being your favorite story of a favorite mistake?
There's so many to choose from. I mean, some of it's situational of like, okay, what type of story? But I come back a lot of times to my very first episode, right? And I would not have this podcast, and I would probably not have this book if not for the opportunity to interview Kevin Harrington, who was one of the sharks on season 1 of Shark Tank. His co-author Mark Tim, who is another entrepreneur, they wrote a book about mentoring and they were promoting that book. And they both came on. And I think, Kevin Harrington, a quick buy on him. He was on Shark Tank. The reason he was there, love him or hate him, he was the inventor of the 30-minute infomercial, like George Foreman grills and products like that, right? So that was his business, and then he got, then he's done a lot of other things. But he came on and told a story, and I was still testing this hypothesis of I think people would be willing to come on and tell a story that would be compelling and not, something that's a false modesty brag story or something. He told a story about a stage, I don't know the exact year, but relatively early in his infomercial business. One of his 12 products at the time suddenly had big, huge manufacturing defect rates. So I know for your just-in-time Lean Six Sigma listeners, they're going to want to fixate on what was the cause of the defects? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know the root cause of that. But what happened though was, Kevin showed up one Monday morning and the bank had completely clamped down their cash flow because they were getting complaints and chargebacks, and this was a huge interruption to his cash flow because of one bad product. It shut down the cash flow for all of them. And he was like, he didn't know if he was going to be able to make payroll, to buy more infomercial spots. He said this is the type of thing that really jeopardized his company. And what I appreciated, and I think this set the tone for others who followed, he didn't blame anybody else. He didn't beat himself up. He said, you know what? I didn't know at the time how risky it was to have everything flowing through the same account. So he learned from it. He kind of broke things up, separated it out. I mean, okay, sure. Let's have products without big defect rates. We would all want that to be part of the story. But he owned what he did or what he hadn't done. He focused on moving forward, making adjustments into his business that would at least prevent that huge risk from occurring again. And I just loved how, he wasn't blaming anybody else. So I admire that. He was focused on how do I take what I've learned here and move forward. If he had just blamed the factory in China or blamed the bank or blamed, he might have moved forward in a way where he didn't make the right adjustments. So I think even right there, going back to episode 1, in a lot of ways, that set the tone, I think, for others to try to come on and follow.
Yeah, no, that's a great story because he's also so public. So people immediately go, oh, Shark Tank. Oh, man. And then just that is a massive.
Well, yeah. And at the beginning of the episode, I asked him, what's your favorite mistake? And he said, maybe half of my guests say something to the effect of I really had to think about this because I've made so many mistakes. And that in and of itself is, I think, reassuring of to listeners or to people, or reminding myself, I don't think people are successful because they don't make mistakes.
Yeah.
I think they're better at learning from their mistakes.
Because they dive in.
That's part of the pattern.
Yeah, no, you're really good at pulling it back to the learning.
Yes.
So, Mark, this isn't a question, but it's an observation. And I was reading and I thought, I've never heard you say this.
Okay.
But you wrote in your introduction about how you personally wanted to change your habit of in your words, I'm quoting you, making occasionally snarky posts that criticize mistake makers, implying that they should know better. And I'm not sure if I ever shared this with you, but I'm one of those people you called out a long time ago.
Really?
Yeah, many years ago, I think we had a running blog on what I was calling visual management. If I look back now, and this led to something actually good, I realized, I was really talking about visual workplaces. And you kind of called me out on using the term wrong. And I think you said something like, are you really helping anybody?
Oh, no.
It was like a slap.
Oh.
And so we had to decide, do we delete this post? I didn't know you.
Right.
I knew you then. Now I was like, who is Mark Graban? And now, and then so I deleted it. I actually went through, tried to change my verbiage. I fixed my mistake. And then when I look at you now, because now I know you, we've collaborated, you're an ally, but I also realize, you have 18 gazillion followers, and you're a leader in our social media world. And you've become kind and constructive. You've also become a great defender of people who get attacked on social media. So you're modeling your ideals for psychological safety. And that's really cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if you thought about that. I mean, I'm sure you do because you're embodying it, but that's really great to see.
Well, so for one, I feel bad. I feel like that was a mistake to have typed what I typed the way I typed it. But I mean, at some point, you're right. There was some reflection. Some of it was the spark of the book Practicing Lean, of trying to adjust some of that behavior. To ask back to my own comment, I could ask myself, was that comment being helpful? Was that comment serving me or you or others well? And so, I mean, that I would say, looking back at it, it was a mistake for me to type what I did the way I did. And I'm sorry for that. I'm not perfect, and I still slip up sometimes, or I try to at least be a little bit more mindful of not typing a reply or something that's, when I'm just sort of like, I don't know, highly activated, like to take a breath or to try to think back, back to the question of is it necessary? Is it kind? Is it helpful? And I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, I guess I had made a point, but I probably didn't make it the right way.
Well, I think what she's also saying is we've seen you grow in your personal journey about people who make mistakes. And, I have to say, I remember this conversation with Elizabeth when it happened, and we were like, oh my gosh, let's stay away from this guy. And now we love you. So because you have done a transformation, and you're really practicing what you're preaching. And, there's lots of people out there that don't, they say be a lean leader, but they're really not doing lean leadership.
And not just practicing what you're preaching. You built a whole podcast around it, and then you've brought this book together. Like you said, it isn't just the podcast, it isn't just the stories, but you're weaving what you've learned and how leaders can make this happen, right? What are the things you've got to do to own and build that culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're practicing, right? And that was part of the spark for the book, Practicing Lean. If we're practicing, hopefully we're getting better, we're learning from mistakes. Sometimes that requires somebody to call out a mistake or to give some feedback.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Otherwise we can't improve. I'm glad this, and I do appreciate you bringing that up, Elizabeth. I was starting to worry for a second though, that suddenly the Zoom was going to expand to like 24 people and it was like an intervention.
Mark Graban, this is your life.
Everyone that I've made a rude comment to.
Do you remember your third grade teacher, Mark? She remembers you.
And we have her on at this podcast right now. Let's bring her in.
Oh, Mrs. Connolly. Oh.
So, Mark, I want to know, is there anything that we didn't ask you that you'd like to share with our audience?
That's a good question. Anything else I should have asked, or I don't know.
Anything you want the audience to know about the book, about you, that we didn't ask you?
I'll tell you one. It's curious, unless you already have it, which is you use cultivate culture instead of build or make. And I'm curious why that verb was significant for you.
That's what you should have asked me. That's perfect that you did. No, you've got me. I'll pause. I'll put the reflecting on hold about previous snarky blog posts or whatever. So I'll put that aside. But the word cultivating, you're right. And kind of iterating around the subtitle. At one point, it was creating a culture of learning and innovation. And I'm like, well, creating. I'm like, we're still kind of agonizing on the subtitle. And they're like, fine, there's never a perfect subtitle, but you want it to be good enough or at least not terrible. And my friend Don, old friend of mine, who is the artist who did the cover design work here, really sharp guy. And he, we were talking about the book and the podcast and what was behind it. And he suggested, well, what about the word cultivating? I really like that, right? Like creating sounds like a one-time event. You don't create a culture and say we're done. Building is a little bit too mechanical, maybe. So then, cultivating, we're like, yeah, it's like a garden. Like you continue feeding and nurturing the garden. And I don't have a garden, so I'm not trying to offer gardening advice. But yeah, I think cultivating, and there's some other people who've written business books where they're using the word cultivate around culture. There's similar root words, and maybe it's a little clunky to say out loud, cultivating a culture.
I love it.
But that's what we landed on. I think there's good meaning behind cultivating. And Elizabeth, you kind of called out like some of the steps to trying to plant a garden map well to our culture work, which is, for one, starting with intent. What garden are we wanting to grow? What plants or crops are we wanting to plant? Now, there are times, and I think, in a positive way, KaiNexus, a company I've been affiliated with for a long time, had more of a discovery of like, hey, there's stuff growing back here. Like let's turn that into a garden of like, there had been intent, as I describe in the book, intent to have a culture of continuous improvement. But then I think what sort of happened naturally was a culture of learning from mistakes. Like that's really strong at KaiNexus. The level of psychological safety is generally really high at KaiNexus. So then at some point, once you discover, okay, that was sort of naturally occurring, now we can declare an intent to turn it into a garden and to keep it growing and keep it thriving. So that happens sometimes as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Go
love
ahead.
that analogy so much. I actually did a presentation called Soil to Success, cultivating a culture of continuous improvement.
Oh,
Talks about
yeah.
green thumbing it, grow your green thumb, and you're going to have a bountiful harvest. But often, how many times have we tried to grow something and like the thing just dies on the vine, right? Like, oh, that was terrible. And those are great
was the soil ready?
Right. Till the
That's
soil,
good.
right?
How do we keep the pests out?
Yeah. And then, just throw the seeds. You got to water it. You got to, talk to your plants.
Well, send me a post. I would love to see what you wrote, because now I'm past the point of trying to worry about not inadvertently plagiarizing somebody.
Yeah, I think
But it's a totally absolute, like, beautiful concept for what we do, because it really, there's a lot of growing to be done there to have a bountiful harvest, and then you have to maintain it. It's not just a one and done, like you said.
Yeah.
So yes.
Yeah. Great verb. I like it too. And I feel like it's nuanced and, build, create, all like you said, there's something kind of mundane and not quite I don't know what the word is, but it's like enticing. As a leader, I feel like cultivate feels more enticing to me. Like, yeah, I want to do that. I'm game to work that, work in that direction.
Yeah. Thanks.
So, Mark, thanks so much for fielding all of our crazy questions and
the observation that wasn't.
And the observation, I feel bad now. It's like you're waiting for all these people to come out of the wings.
No. Sorry.
But,
See, I know you well enough now. I'm giving you grief. I'm not trying to.
But I mean, sincerely, your role in social media, in our kind of social workplace, the role you play has become incredibly helpful, and you are a leader there. So,
thank you.
I do appreciate.
Well, thank you. I was just going to add one other thing, though. I think at some point there's this realization of the different role of like, well, I'm just some guy sharing my thoughts online versus, oh, there's potentially 520,000 people on LinkedIn who are going to be exposed to what I shared. And like that, I mean, so that followership, has grown over time, but I don't, at some point, yeah, there's this realization of some of the obligation that comes with that, or sort of being on like, oh, I can't be like, oh, I'm just a guy sharing thoughts. Like it's very much on display, and I can't just take the positive that comes with that. There's some obligation to use that responsibly and or be on my best behavior, and not that I feel like I'm censoring myself, but I'm trying to, grow and just be more constructive.
And
Well, I mean, and best behavior is modeling the way, which you are, which is wonderful.
you know what you did, Mark? You pictured yourself a leader. Oh, I worked that in. Okay. So Mark, I want you to tell us the best way for folks to reach you if they're interested. And of course, we're going to provide links to the book and more for our audience.
So yeah, markgraban.com. They can find me there. The book's website is mistakesbook.com. Elizabeth, you brought up a mistake that makes us. My mistake, I don't know, our mistakes, it's intertwined here. It made us in some way. So yeah, the mistakes that make us, mistakesbook.com. The podcast is similar, My Favorite Mistake, and they can go to mistakespodcast.com. And then LinkedIn is probably the main online social media place where I'm active these days.
It's been a pleasure, Mark. Thank you so much for coming on the cafe.
Yes, thanks, Mark. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's always a strong cup of coffee and a good pick-me-up, so thank you.
Be sure to register for our Wednesday, July 26th webinar featuring the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Innovation for the City of Port St. Lucie, Florida, Kate Parmalee, and her team. The webinar is titled Strategic Innovation, Empowering Change Makers. They're going to give us the keys to their success and how they built their strategic plan. You don't want to miss this. Really good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking for guidance on becoming a better leader and better at lean cultural transformation, come join Elizabeth and I for our interactive course at UC San Diego called Lean Six Sigma Leadership. It starts this August. It really focuses on leader standard work, and you can join from anywhere in the world because it is a virtual class. And oh, by the way, don't forget to order Elizabeth's book. Be sure to get a copy of the best-selling Picture Yourself a Leader, because you are one, whether you know it or not, and you can get better at it. All the links are below.
And be sure to check out Baby Got Tools, Tracy's new hit lean parody rap video. It will pump you up to crush waste. Lastly, Tracy and I are going to be reissuing the Problem Solvers Toolkit this fall. The demand keeps increasing, so Tracy and I are giving it some TLC. We'll keep you posted on the relaunch. Stay tuned for all the news by joining our community at the Just in Time Cafe. That's JITCAFE.com. We're always psyched to have your company. The Just in Time Cafe is a great place to visit. Just listening to us makes you 80% smarter.
Join us next month and every month for your jolt of lean caffeine.